about Moses and talk a little bit about God's plan and God's time. God's plan and God's time. You can look in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verses 17 through 36, and see the story of Moses unfold in another sermon preached long ago by a man named Stephen. He preached this message to the great council and the high priest, and there Stephen spoke highly of Moses. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 29, we see Moses mentioned right alongside all these great people of faith. You know, the chapter of faith, Hebrews 11. He's now amongst, in Hebrews 12, that great cloud of witnesses that are cheering us on. Amen. To lay aside every weight and that sin which so easily ensnares us. He's there cheering us on to run the race that is set before us with our eyes fixed on Jesus Christ, who is the perfecter of our faith. You see Moses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke on the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses standing there beside Christ in all of his glory, and then Elijah on the other side. Moses, needless to say, can be used as a great example of what it means to walk out God's plan in God's time. Back in the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 1. We see a new king had come on the scene in Egypt. This king didn't know Joseph. He didn't know all of Joseph's contributions to the nation of Egypt, and actually kind of saved their hide in a horrible drought. And this new Pharaoh, he looked at the children of Israel, how they were flourishing, and he saw them as a potential threat. So he set out to squash their vitality. He set out to break their spirits by making their lives hard. I mean, really hard. Worse than hard, if you will. He wanted to crush the spirit of these people. And unbeknownst to him, this was God's people. He made life very hard. He built cities, raised mighty buildings by pushing the Israelites, who were now slaves, past the point of breaking. But in Exodus 1:12 it says this: the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. No matter what the king threw at the children of Israel, they thrived. Lesson number 1 in God's plan and God's time. Lesson number 1, life is hard and can get harder. You hear me? Life is hard and can get harder. Whether it makes us or breaks us is directly related to where we are in relation to God's plan for us. Amen. 1 Peter 3:9 says this: the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, or toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. It is God's will. It is God's plan that all come to repentance. Amen. Amen. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, and then chapter 2 through verse 10, 1 through 10, we see dread now has come on this Pharaoh and his cohorts. This dread brought about drastic and desperate measures. He had actually he made a decree that all the male children of Israel be killed on birth. We're going to kill them. And we look back at this decree and we think to ourselves, how could this be? I mean, how could anyone make such a law or a decree? And how could the people go along with it? How could this be? But I ask you just for a moment with me this morning to take a look around us. It turns our stomachs to think of that thing. But look around us. The most recent numbers I could find were published in April of this year. Since the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973 until April of 2017, there have been 59,115,995 legal abortions here in this great nation. I was born in 73. That's almost 60 million lives snuffed out before their time here among us. Somehow we are desensitized to these horrific numbers. We look at history aghast at the atrocious decree made by a long ago king in a faraway land. We can't even muster a single tear for those voices crying out from the wombs to the tombs in our great nation. Acts 7, 20 through 22. It was times like this that Moses was born. Tough times. Moses was born in Acts 7, 20. Puts it like this: at this time Moses was born, and was well pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Lesson number 2, God's plan can and will take place even in the midst of total moral and social breakdown. You can depend on God's plan. You can. It's going to take place regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how bleak and how dark things may seem. God's plan will stand. Now back to Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. It's hard to get a 50-minute sermon out in 10 minutes. Back to Exodus 2 and verses 11 through 25. We've already seen that Moses had found favor in the eyes of God. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen alludes to God's call on Moses' life when he was 40 years old to lead the children of Israel out. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Moses goes out amongst his brethren and he sees their burden. He sees that their life is horribly hard under this new Pharaoh. Then he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own brothers. And verse 12 says, so he looked this way and he looked that way. You know it. He looked this way and that way, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. Nobody's looking. So he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand. Well, the next day, Moses found out just how quickly word travels. Word was out. And so he feared for his life, and rightfully so, because when the Pharaoh heard about it, looked to kill Moses. Moses had already fled to the land of Midian. You can sense the defeat as you read in verse 15, where Moses had sat down by a well. He was done. He was spent. He was done. He messed it up. He messed up this call of God to lead the children of Israel. Sat down by a well, but it was here in the land of Midian that Moses met his blessed wife. It was here in Midian that he would tend the sheep for 40 years, the sheep of his father-in-law, and no doubt learned much about leading people while leading these sheep around.
That's right.
Lesson number 3, Brother Jerry, the wrong thing done for the right reason is still the wrong thing.
That's right.
The wrong thing done for the right reason is still the wrong thing. Finally, in Exodus 3, we come to the well-known verses where Moses, now 80 years old, is tending the flocks of Jethro. When something catches his eye, there was a bush. It was on fire, and it wasn't burning up. It just kept burning and burning and burning. Verse 3, Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight while the bush is not burned. It is here that God spoke to Moses. He said, Moses, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. In this encounter, God verifies the call that at age 40, Moses thought was ruined with bad timing and worse decisions. I often wonder, and I do, if Moses thought about God's plan for his life during those 40 years. Long years in Midian while leading the sheep. I wonder if he pondered what could have been, what should have been. I wonder if the thought of another chance ever crossed his mind. But regardless of past regret, we see God clearly call Moses to lead the nation of Israel out of slavery and bondage where they now find themselves. God's plan for Moses' life is now being revealed in God's time. The rest of the story will have to wait for another day and another 10 minutes. Lesson number 4, God's plan and God's time is the only way to go.
Amen.
Theme for today is that God has a plan, so does Satan. Which one will you choose? The choice is now, the choice is ours. I want to encourage each of you, from the oldest to the youngest, I want to encourage you to choose God's plan. If your timing has been off until now, choose this day who you will serve.
Amen.
If you've fallen for the bait of Satan, I want you to know there's a common thread throughout God's holy word. And this common thread is redemption, the redemption story. As long as you have breath in your lungs, you have a chance, you have a choice. Choose God.
Amen. Amen.